there's been a huge amount written about risk over the years. I dug out some of my books.
Yes, that's very impressive. That's almost as big a pile as mine. Not quite.
And a number of those are yours. But we're here to talk about this book, Taming the Risk Hurricane, which is your latest, I think.
It is, yes.
And I wondered, given everything that you've written in the past and everything everybody else has written in the past, why this book and what's the significance of the analogy?
Well, I've written, I think, 13 or 14 books, and you've published quite a few of them in your previous life, all about risk, but all different. And the reason is that risk management is such a fascinating topic. There's so many elements and angles of it. So I can write about culture or about psychology or about leadership or about projects or about methodologies. And they're all about risk, but at different levels. And this is something I've wanted to write about for quite a while, which is around, at the corporate level, around corporate crisis. And something beyond business continuity management. I felt we needed a more holistic approach. So that's where this particular book, where the message of it came from. It's, as I've kind of moved up the food chain of talking to people about risk, this is an area that I think is not well understood, and that's why the book's come.
Yes, and the analogy, the hurricane analogy.
Yes, well, as you know, I think communication is key about risk, and you need to understand the concepts. You need to have a message to tell, but then how you tell the message is as important. So when I'm preparing a presentation, for example, I'll spend as much time on how we're actually going to pitch it and communicate that as I do on developing the content. So analogy is a great mechanism for communicating a lot of things. You start with sort of creating something, start with something familiar, create some echoes and resonances, and then interpret those. So actually the idea of the risk hurricane came from another author, a chap called Joseph Mayo, who wrote a book called Cultural Calamity. And in passing, he uses this term, the risk hurricane, for a kind of cultural melee of chaos within an organisation, but he doesn't develop it at all. And I reviewed his book and I wrote to Joe and I said, I love this idea of the risk hurricane, but you could develop it so much further. For example, this and this. Would you like to collaborate? And he said, I don't really want to collaborate. I've got other interests. He was into asset risk management at the time. And so I said, well, look, would you mind if I took the concept of risk hurricane and ran with it? He said, go, you take it. So I have obviously an acknowledgement for Joe Mayo and that book, Cultural Calamity, but I've taken it a lot further. And he's reviewed the book, he's happy with the way I've used his original idea. But it was the idea that when we're in corporate crisis or any other sort of crisis, things are kind of swirling around and it is pretty chaotic. But that didn't come from nowhere. A hurricane, you can see it developing quite a long way off. You can prepare for it. It throws all sorts of things up in the air, and where they settle, who knows. But then you have to tidy up afterwards. Yeah. And that whole sort of life cycle of a hurricane seemed to me to be a good match for corporate crisis or crisis within an organisation. Yes. And so that's where I got it from.
Yeah, and I guess extending the analogy, for every hurricane that hits you, there are the 5 or so that just
near
get a near miss.
Yes, that's right.
And of course, that's something in projects that people are aware of, but just take for granted.
And what's a hurricane for one organisation or for one major project is just a passing interest over there for somebody else, and is not relevant at all. And we must come to that, because it's important to understand the impact of a particular set of circumstances on you and your organisation and your project, as opposed to just the world at large. We see things happening in the Caribbean or various parts of the world and we go, tut tut, how awful. But it doesn't affect me really, unless I have some other interest. And so the whole idea of stakeholders and, they're all relevant here.
Yes. So, let's pursue that idea. So if we look at big, complex projects and particular organisations, what are the kinds of things that make them more or less susceptible to the impact of a hurricane?
Well, so the first thing is to define the term. So we should just say that I use the term risk hurricane quite precisely. It means circumstances of extreme risk exposure which lead to major disruption. So it's about risk. It's a risk hurricane, That's the working side of the analogy. The natural hurricane is the starting point of the analogy, but the point is to talk about risk. So a risk hurricane is circumstances of extreme risk exposure, and it's not just the normal sorts of things that we have in life or in business or in projects. It's extreme. And it's not just extreme uncertainty, but it has a real impact. It has a major disruption in the business and in the project. So it's important to see that these are quite unique, quite they're what do you call them? Tail events. They're extreme events.
Tail risk. Yeah,
yes.
yeah.
So this is not the sort of thing that happens all the time. But a hurricane doesn't come from nowhere. So a natural hurricane has basically three prerequisites. The first is that it comes from the west, it comes across the Atlantic. And we should say there are also typhoons and cyclones, which are what you call a hurricane in another part of the world. Exactly the same thing applies. But it starts off with low pressure, with warm water, and with circulating vortices of air. And you need all three of those in order to start developing a tropical disturbance, then a tropical storm, and then ultimately maybe a hurricane. And it could drop off at any of those points in the development. So I think each of those three indicates an area of susceptibility for an organisation or a project. So warm water, in my mind, is about the external environment, about uncertainty, all of those different sources, the VUCA environment, we talk about volatility, uncertainty, complexity and ambiguity, or a PESTLE with political, environmental, social, technological, legal and economic, all these different sources. And it's the more it heats up, the more likely there is for a risk hurricane to form. Then you've got the low pressure, and I liken that to the internal environment and the culture of the organisation. And where that's low or weak, then you combine that with an external environment where things are circulating and chaotic, and then you have a weak internal culture. The two together start to create vulnerabilities. But together with that, if you have this vortex of change, so you get a high rate of change within and outside of the organisation, combining with lots of uncertainty and a weak culture, then you've really got dynamite about to happen. Yeah. And so those are the kind of generic characteristics that an organisation or a project might be experiencing, which together can lead to extreme risk exposure coming from your warm water and your internal culture, which is exacerbated by the vortex of change, which then leads to the potential of significant business disruption.
Yeah, interesting. I mean, it's interesting that we've got the issue of climate change, so more frequent hurricanes, and equally in the business environment, the major projects environment, we've got kind of fundamental and accelerating change. So there's a direct.
It's quite timely, isn't it?
Yeah.
And they're not only more frequent, but they're more severe.
Yes.
And that's the other thing, is not all hurricanes are equal. And not all corporate crisis or crisis in major projects is the same. And so we have categories of hurricane, we also have categories of risk hurricane. So in the book I talk about the base definition, and you have the Beaufort wind scale, which says anything that has a wind speed of over 73 miles an hour, sea state of above 50 feet more or less waves, that qualifies as a hurricane. But above 73 miles an hour could be 74 or 90 or 120. And so they fairly quickly, the meteorologists recognised they needed categories of risk hurricane. And so we're familiar with the Cat 1, Cat 3, Cat 5 hurricane, which is quite tightly defined in the meteorological world by, there's the WMO, the World Meteorological Organisation. And I think we need to think similarly when we're thinking about corporate crisis or major business disruption. They're not all the same. You can have a Category 1 business disruption, or you can have a Cat 5, which is absolutely existential and disastrous.
Yes.
And what does that mean? How do we define those? And so I talk about that kind of scale in the book as well.
Okay. So in the face of hurricanes, what do you advocate organisations do? Is it fundamentally different from what you might have said in the past in terms of managing risk? How should an organisation kind of address the risk of hurricanes?
Well, obviously risk management is important, and I've spent my career in the last 35 years encouraging people to understand and manage the risks that they face, wherever they face them. And to recognise, and this is an interesting point we might come to, that there are upside risks as well as downside risks, opportunities as well as threats. And standard risk management is important for dealing with standard risks. And so we have a well-established process, tools and techniques and guidance and standards and all those sorts of things to deal with standard risks. And we must do standard risk management.
Yes.
But when you get extreme risk exposure, then you need an extreme approach, and you need something which is quite different from the sort of routine day-to-day risk management.
Yes.
So I'm not saying in this book, forget everything else we've talked about in the last 30 years, that's not really important. That is important. But this is something that needs to be added into the mix for those particular occasions that do arise.
Yes, yes.
So what can we do? I mean, there are short-term things, long-term things. There are internal things, external things. There are process things. There are people things. And really, the focus of the book, it's not just an interesting analogy that you go, oh, I hadn't thought of that. That's, it's actually an action book. So obviously, you need to, in the short term, understand your areas of vulnerability, and there's a nicely developed vulnerability assessment approach in the book. Once you know what's vulnerable in the short term, you should protect your vulnerable areas, your vulnerable assets, your vulnerable people, your vulnerable processes, your supply line. All of those standard vulnerabilities need to be protected. And this is where business continuity, standard business continuity is quite helpful. Or project continuity, which is the project version of business continuity, which I've been talking about for 5 or 10 years actually. Taking the BC techniques and principles and bringing them into the project world. And I think there's a lot we can learn from that. So short-term things, protect and preserve. But you also need to think about long-term changes that you can make, which will make you less vulnerable in the way that you operate, in the way that you set up your projects, in the way that your business is established. So single points of failure, single lines of supply, all of those things really bad. You need to make sure you haven't got those. There are the cultural things. So if you've got the external change and the internal culture and the vortex of change in the environment, we can address our culture. That takes longer, 2 to 3 years to change culture. So thinking about which aspects of culture are contributing to making us vulnerable to significant uncertainty and doing something about that.
Okay.
And the whole area of resilience then comes into play, organisational resilience, personal resilience in your leadership and staff, project resilience in terms of your processes, and so there's a lot that can be done in that area. You would think that a hurricane is all out a bad thing, wouldn't you? But it isn't, actually, because hurricanes in the natural world, they do serve a purpose. So they expose the things that are weak. They uproot the trees that were a little bit shaky. They knock down the walls that were cracked and didn't have good foundations. They take out the buildings that weren't built according to sound building codes. And so a hurricane can clear the ground in quite a useful way. And we see that we had our big storm here in 1987, and loads of trees were ripped up. But look what's happened. There's been renewal and regeneration, and that whole sort of eco-cycle just continues to refresh and renew and regenerate. And actually exposing the weaknesses in our organisations and in our projects, and having a big passage of major uncertainty and risk exposure that goes through and just throws everything up in the air, does give us opportunities to do something different. So you could say, in our prior vulnerability assessment, we've identified some things that are a little bit at risk. So now, before we get the significant risk exposure, we have the opportunity to fix them. But that's not the same as risk opportunity. That's opportunity to act. Risk opportunity is about uncertainty that, if it occurs, has a positive impact. And so the clearing the ground kind of impact of significant risk exposure can actually create all sorts of possibilities that weren't there before. Yes.
I mean, I think clearly with the pandemic and the lockdown, the way in which that really shook rather kind of ossified governance processes, and it allowed and gave people permission to introduce innovation and introduce new use of technology that might have taken 5 or 10 times as long if we hadn't had that kind of...
Exactly, and we've got the whole phrase of build back better.
Yes.
And what does build back better mean? How do we define better? Is it doing the same thing more efficiently, or is it doing something different to meet the same objectives, or is it actually meeting different objectives? So there are different levels of build back better. And I think that phrase has become quite limited to kind of repair and recover, instead of looking more broadly to say, well, now, what could we do now that actually everything's gone up in the air and it's come down in a different place? Do we just try and move it back to where it was, or do we see where we now are, and how do we meet our previous objectives against within the new situation? Or does this allow us to meet new objectives as well, or instead of?
Yeah.
And so you've got that whole area of not just bouncing back, which is traditional resilience, but bouncing forward.
Yes.
And moving on to something else. So not just bounce back ability, but bounce forward ability.
Yes.
And the risk hurricane, extreme risk exposure, does create that possibility that wasn't there before.
Yes.
And the thing with risk management, of course, is it's predictive and proactive. So the idea of this is, just like we have, weather forecasters who have a cone of uncertainty that say the hurricane is going to go over here, and as time goes out, the cone gets wider because we're not quite sure. But it's going to take this kind of general track. Therefore, if you're in the path, you need to get ready. We can do exactly the same with a risk hurricane in advance, before it arrives, to say, well, it's coming from here. When it arrives, it's going to be this big and hit us in this way, and then it's going to go this way. And so in advance, we can start to prepare how we might actually take advantage once the hurricane has passed. And so the whole idea of being predictive and proactive really applies in business and major projects.
Yes.
To say, we can see this is coming. It might be not very pleasant at the time, but what can we do about it afterwards?
Yes.
And so part of your preparation is pre-positioning resources, so that when it's passed, you've got the things in place that you can recover.
Yes.
But also looking forward to saying, well, what will we be able to do in advance, and what will we need for that, which is different and better.
Yes, yeah. I find this interesting because it seems to be a sea change in the way that organisations manage risk, or many organisations manage risk at the moment. I'm not suggesting that this is necessarily a good thing, but traditionally the approach has been to try and offset as much risk as possible, to push as much risk onto the first tier contractors and then down the supply chain.
Well, that's not resilience, that's robustness.
Yes.
We want to be as strong as possible so that we can resist the forces of change that come and the disruption that is inevitable. We just want to resist it,
yes,
which is fine while you can. But robustness either leads to success or failure. You either maintain what you have, or the wall falls and then you're disrupted when you get flooded or you get blown over, or whatever the disaster is that's coming. So robustness is fine as far as it goes, but when it fails, it fails.
yes,
Resilience is about saying, well, in addition to being robust in some areas, we're going to allow ourselves to bend, allow ourselves to be deformed, but then be prepared to bounce back.
yes.
But what we really need, and the idea of anti-fragility, for example, Taleb's rather strange idea, is that not just being strong in some areas and being accepting deformation, and bouncing back, but some areas we need to recognise will make us stronger. And the idea of the impact will make you stronger than you were before the impact came, so you can welcome it.
Yes.
And you can say, well, so as long as we can survive, there's a strange saying, what doesn't kill you will make you stronger, unless it kills you. And I think we do have to recognise sometimes these things are existential.
Yes,
and you may not survive.
I think that's interesting because in a changing market and a moving market, I feel very strongly that major projects should have a remit for developing knowledge and capability. So we're not just putting a piece of infrastructure in the ground.
Absolutely.
We're actually learning from day one to day whatever, so that we are better at doing more uncertain, more imaginative, more demanding projects in the future. And if we don't get that, as well as whatever particular output we're creating,
that's always been the problem with lessons learned and post-project reviews, and we're far too busy for all of that. And what tends to happen is you have a successful or a challenged project, you get through it in the end, and then people wipe their brains, they throw the team away and they start again for the next project, forget everything they learned. Well, that's no way to run a business or a country or anything.
Yes.
And so the learning of how to do this type of project is a key deliverable of the project.
Yes.
And as we know, in terms of benefits management, it should be built in from the beginning as one of the objectives, not just to deliver deliverables to our clients and customers and stakeholders, but to improve and strengthen the business.
Yes. Yeah. What do we want to be able to do that we can't do at the moment?
Yes.
By the end of this project.
Yes, exactly that.
Yeah.